Tomorrow, October 11th, is National Coming Out Day. I've been a big fan of the holiday ever since college. In those days, especially among young adults, coming out was one of those major life-defining events. And still today, coming out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, ... is a big step. Still today, coming out risks rejection from family, from friends, from work. For a lot of people, the most precarious place to come out is their faith community. For many LGBT people, part of carving out space for themselves in the world requires finding or creating a faith community where they aren't just tolerated, but celebrated for all of who they are. This morning, I want to talk about some of the creativity and the courage and the sacrifice that comes through in these faith journeys. It may not be as apparent as straight people or living in a country where religious freedom is a huge cultural norm, but being a part of a faith community involves a serious level of sacrifice sometimes. The video that we saw earlier was an interview with Reverend Troy Perry. We heard a little bit about the opening of the church in that video. I want to share with you some of Troy Perry's story that led him to that point, though. It's a bit of a saga. Troy Perry was a self-described religious fanatic as a very young person. At the age of 15, he dropped out of high school to be a certified Baptist preacher. By 19, he found himself married to a pastor's daughter, fathering 2 sons, and leading a small Church of God congregation of his own. While leading that church, an affair with a man led the family to relocate to Southern California. Shortly after that, his wife left him after she found the book, The Homosexual in America, stashed under the mattress. Like, who hides things under a mattress? In 1965, Perry was drafted into the military. He spent a couple of years in Germany. He finally landed back in Los Angeles. In LA, he was able to carve out a life for himself as a gay man, but thought there was no space for him left in religion. He found a relationship. In 1968, that relationship ended, which drove him into a serious depression, including a suicide attempt. But out of that despair, a sense of spirituality returned, and he began to pray again. Shortly after that, one of Perry's friends was harassed and arrested by police just for buying a beer in a gay bar. As he tried to console his friend, the friend said, "God doesn't care. God doesn't care about gay people." So that whole series of events led him to hold that very first worship service at his home, October 6th, 1968. I can imagine how scary that gathering would have been. 12 people sitting there every time the door opens, expecting it to be the police. And then Troy Perry, this leader that no one really knew at that point, this out gay man stands up and serves communion to other out gay people. It was an act of profound rebellion. And sensing the power of that ritual, they decided that sharing communion was something they would do every time they gathered. To this day, MCC churches are required to serve communion every week. So that initial group of 12 grew rapidly, as you heard, so that today there are 222 congregations in 37 different countries in the denomination. Success of that kind doesn't always bring safety, though. Being outspoken and out caused several of the churches to be targets for arson, including their mother church in Los Angeles. Because the church was formed by those who had been excluded, they took to heart that message and that mission to be as inclusive as possible. Another faithful person who carved out a new path was a friend of mine, Faisal Alam. I don't keep in touch with him very much, but back in college, we were pretty close. As a young Muslim, Faisal created the organization Al-Fatiha. It's a community where queer Muslim people of all nationalities could gather every once in a while for social support and prayer. And that name, Al-Fatiha, means the opening. It's the name of the first chapter of the Quran. And in the beginning of that chapter, Allah is described as compassionate and merciful. The founders of Al-Fatiha believe that those attributes characterize Islam better than the hatred and homophobia that can also be found. Faisal's stories of assisting LGBT people escape from family violence and the personal death threats that he received were truly harrowing. Some faithful people had to build completely new institutions wherever they could. Others worked really hard to reform the denominations they were in. Every sizable faith community in the United States has a group of LGBT people fighting to change within. This is important for us to know and appreciate. Every one of them. Muslims, Mormons, Catholics, Baptists, Jews, you name it. They all have groups of people trying to create space for themselves to live and to worship with authenticity. And Unitarian Universalism has had our own journey of coming to support LGBT rights. In recognition of National Coming Out Day, I want to share with you some of our coming out story as a denomination. In 1967, a denominational survey was conducted on beliefs about homosexuality. Over 80% of Unitarian Universalists believe that it should be discouraged. Hold that as your marker for progress. In 1967, 80% of UUs thought homosexuality should be discouraged. Just 2 years later, in 1969, James Lewis Stoll came out at the annual conference of UU students. He was the first ordained minister of an established denomination to come out as gay. Prior to that, ministers who were discovered to be gay were fired from their congregations, no questions. A lot of UU sources that I found celebrate his coming out and being the first minister to do so. They celebrate that as part of our story. What they fail to include in those stories, though, is the fact that he never found a job serving a UU congregation. He had a successful career in counseling, but not in UU ministry. The year after he came out, in 1970, the General Assembly, that's our big national meeting, passed a resolution to end discrimination against gays and lesbians. Things started rolling. In 71, the UUA published a sexuality education curriculum that attempted to include positive depictions of homosexuality and bisexuality. It's that curriculum, of course, that evolved into OWL, something that's still run today, that's hugely popular. In 1973, 74, and 75, the UUA created and then funded and then staffed the Office of Gay Affairs in our national headquarters. And yes, they actually called it the Office of Gay Affairs. In 1980, things shifted pretty significantly for clergy. That year, in 1980, two openly gay ministers were settled into serving UU congregations for the first time. Douglas Morgan Strong and Mark Bellatini. Douglas Morgan Strong recalled a little bit of that journey and his meeting with the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. That's the committee that either gives their stamp of approval for ministers or not. He said, "When I went before the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, I was petrified. Back then, the number of out gay ministers successfully serving congregations was easy to count. There were none." Fresh in his memory was the contentious vote about forming that Office of Gay Affairs. And talking about the debate at General Assembly, he said, "I recall one of my colleagues asking the Assembly if the next step would be an Office of Bestiality." We were making progress as a denomination, but it wasn't without painful arrows and a whole lot of fear. In 1988, the first openly transgender person was ordained into UU ministry. That's actually a long time ago. It took until 2002 for the Reverend Sean Parker Dennison and Reverend Lori Affont to be the first trans people settled into UU ministry. Also, part of that march toward equality in ministry was the creation of Beyond Categorical Thinking. That's a program that's still run today. Every time a congregation is interviewing and searching for a new minister, they are required to have a workshop about welcoming different gifts of ministers who are LGBT or people of color or people with disabilities. Today, they're still running that. The program started in 1988 in response to some congregations getting pretty far down that road with interviewing ministers until their sexual orientation became known and then revoking the offer. We learned a lot, but in life, most learning comes with struggles and mistakes, right? We know about the Welcoming Congregation program. That started in 1989. It's a program that Tapestry and a lot of other congregations have done to be actively welcoming and supportive. By the year 2000, a quarter of UU congregations had gone through that program, and by 2006, more than half had done so. More recently, we've been outspoken advocates for marriage equality. Closer to home, some of you probably recall, the Reverend John Millspaugh here at Tapestry was one of the few ministers in Orange County that was a strong voice in opposition to Proposition 8. The fight for federal marriage equality was a long one. It took until 2015. It's kind of amazing how long ago that seems and how recent it actually is. So some of you who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, you've taken pretty big risks to fully express who you are in the world. For most of us, it's difficult to imagine having a significant part of our identity so politically unpopular that just speaking it aloud could be dangerous. As I look back at the way people have come out religiously, I saw stories of tremendous courage and creativity and hope. In the Minister's Seminar, several of us recently read a book about early Christianity. It wasn't the focus of the book, but there were lots of stories of martyrs and people who sacrificed in tremendous ways for their faith. Reading about them, the question naturally arose in our group, oh my goodness, that was terrible. What would you sacrifice for your faith? Similarly, as we learned about UU history, we hear about Michael Servetus, the Spanish theologian, burned at the stake with his books that were questioning the Trinity. More recently, we hear of Reverend Toribio Quimada, the founder of the UU Church in the Philippines, who was murdered there for his political advocacy and religious, really, success in building a church there. We know of James Reeb and Viola Liozzo, UUs who were murdered in Selma for their participation in civil rights efforts there. And of course, as we reflect on faithful LGBT people who carved out a path, as I hear the stories of their sacrifice and commitment, I am humbled. So I was fully prepared to end this sermon with that question: what are you willing to sacrifice for your faith? But then slowly, I remembered how much so many of you put into this community. Over the course of years of membership, most of you have spent thousands of dollars supporting Tapestry. Many of you, tens of thousands of dollars. Similarly, you have spent a lot of time and energy in this community. Just showing up at worship, we forget. Being here makes community possible. Many of you have served on communities or helped produce worship. You've cooked and cleaned and moved and folded. A precious handful of you have turned a Tapestry volunteer gig into a full-time, unpaid job. We're not persecuted for our faith today. Unitarian Universalism is safe from violence, but this faith of ours is fragile. We are a tiny tradition. There are 1,027 UU congregations in the United States, with 153,000 adult members of those congregations. That's not very many. This faith of ours is fragile. I'm not going to go into the whole history of it, but we were nearly bankrupted by the CIA and legal fees when we published the Pentagon Papers and took that legal stance. For a period of time, the Boy Scouts of America refused to recognize Unitarian Universalism as a valid religion because of our embrace of LGBT people in our theology. My point is, liberal faith needs all the support it can get. In this increasingly secular world where we seem to be stuck in a no man's land between fundamentalism and the spiritual but not religious, we need all the support we can get. And Tapestry is our spiritual home. I hope that it feels like a solid foundation in times of turmoil. I really do. I also hope that you don't take this church or this faith tradition for granted. When you support this community, you aren't just doing it for yourself and your own access, or because you like the people here. Hopefully, you're also showing your support so that others like you, or others not like you, will have a place where they can live their faith authentically. Amen.